Donc, nous sommes contents d'accueillir aujourd'hui Otto, qui va nous parler de la notion de règle dans les grammaires missionnaires de la tradition espagnole, Mexique et Philippines.
Oui, merci bien. It's a bit misleading, the title was in French, but I apologize that I'm going to give this lecture in English, as I'm actually used to do. I feel still a bit more comfortable with this, but maybe if this causes some problems, of course you can interrupt me and I can see what I can do. There are also many slides which are in Spanish. I have not translated them all, but we shall analyze them. And first of all, I want to express my gratitude to the organizers, because I found this topic really important and fascinating. Over the last decades, I always wondered, why is something called a rule and what does it mean, and how is the rule used and for what purposes, and how are rules taught. And this is a very important topic, so I'm really very happy to see this in our Séance as a topic, and it is also closely related to the topic recently also analyzed about prolixity and how useful can a grammar be, and how much material do we need, and how many rules, or the theoretical part, and how much can be included from the practical side. And this has a epistemological dimension, and of course a practical dimension. And as always, when we analyze missionary works, it will be very complicated, because as you have noticed already in other sessions, the corpus is so big that everything you want to find, you will find it, and maybe you will miss something. And of course, if we talk about didactics, or about theory, or approaches, attitudes, or sometimes we can find a very systematic answer to our questions we have today. But of course, they have not seen the same questions, and they had different occupations, and missionaries sometimes did not give our answers systematically. But as I want to demonstrate today again, there is sometimes a possibility to give kind of overview, and what does us interest more, the more general picture, as all or most missionaries are doing, or maybe just highlighting some interesting topics which was maybe not the most usual solution. That can be an individual solution to a specific problem. And today, as always, I want to try to find a balance a little bit between what I think is what we could call a kind of tradition, and also I will highlight some topics which we can link maybe to some individual opinions. And for that reason, I had to limit my corpus, of course, because it's too big. And I selected some grammars from New Spain. I start a little bit, of course, about Spain itself, the Spanish sources. And of course, Nebrija will be mentioned as always. And then I have a short excursus to some Arabic studies done by missionaries. And this is the reasons. I have a reason for that, because it's just an example to see what was considered regular and what was actually seen as something irregular. Or maybe if it's irregular, it's still within a grammar entitled or labeled as irregular, but even outside irregularities, you can find some topics we can not classify in a grammar. And this is a short excursion to Arabic studies, but most will be about some grammars of Otto from New Spain, and the other part is from the Philippines. The Philippines were closely related to New Spain, of course. And why did I choose these two regions? I think that they are quite different from itself. And I think in both case studies, we can see a kind of tradition or something which is not specific for just one work. Actually, we can find interesting differences in both yeah, we can call that traditions, and for several reasons. I will demonstrate that. And I also think that some who have seen already a little bit from Mesoamerica, or maybe from Quechua, or maybe Aymara, the Andes, they will have probably an idea. Nahuatl is studied very well, also in the missionary period, but also today. There are a lot of sources, there are a lot of studies, but I think the Otomi collection, if I count the really Otomangue collection, which is already available on the CTLF, edited by Bernard Colomba, they even outnumber the Nahuatl sources, and the languages are so much different from each other. And this also led to some different solutions to what we can call approaches to the rules and the exceptions. And maybe we can say a little bit the same about the Philippines. Of course, there are scholars in the world, but I think few scholars still are aware of not only the quantity of the linguistic production in the Philippines, but also the quality of them. And I think it's interesting to have them both today. And I shall try to make a kind of overview of, in the conclusion, what you can find in these traditions. And I want to start sharing you the screen which I prepared for today. I do it right now. It's here, the title. It is unfortunately the only French text you will see today. And this is more or less the outline of the topics I want to present. Already a long time ago, I tried to find some explanations why a certain text is called an Arte. Others prefer Gramática. You find also metodo, and also some grammars had in the specific title also the word rules, or just a combination of them. So I was just wondering, is there a kind of systematic approach? Why did they choose those titles? Or are they near synonyms? Or is there maybe a difference in approach? I think from the descriptive point of view, but also from the didactic point of view, we can discuss that as well. And the same I've done for the dictionaries. Some traditions prefer the term vocabulary, vocabulario, and others prefer dictionario. And this is a near synonym, but there are some differences in some sources, and the same applies for the titles of the grammars. And then I want to devote some minutes to the titles of the chapters and the books and the paragraphs and the sections, because the regla is often labeled as something special, and sometimes they are just like a remark in a text. You find suddenly a paragraph with the title regla. Sometimes you have numbered reglas, and sometimes you have an entire section with only reglas. So I want to give the context about the status of the reglas, not as title of the grammar, because we have that as well, but also as title of a section, a paragraph, or a book, or anything you can imagine. As I said, if you are looking for something, you find the second source and the third source, and then you think maybe it's a tradition, but maybe the fourth and the fifth and the sixth are already so different. And that is what I want to stress today. We see some tendencies, but there are also so many differences. It's just commonly known that they are all based on Nebrija or any other Western source. But if you compare the grammars, you will directly see that they are so different from each other. And that makes them, according to my point of view, even more interesting. So there will be also information about what kind of information was relevant to be documented by those missionaries. It can be accompanied by some theoretical approaches and some definitions, and sometimes it's more based, or the practice is highlighted. How can we use to apply the rules, and also very important, how to teach the rules, and even it's interesting where, at home or maybe in the classroom. There are some observations about that kind of approaches. And this is linked to the discussion, which is very popular in those days. I'm talking, of course, for the period from the 16th, part of the 15th even, but 16th and 17th and 18th centuries. And of course, there was a discussion about the use, the uso and the norma, and what does a grammar need to describe? And is it even possible to describe language, and what about the usage? And so this about theory and practice will be linked to that discussion which exists in Spain. So then I will tell a little bit about what is regular and what is irregular according to their views. And then again, as I said, a part is about Spain, a part is about New Spain, and there is a section about the Philippines. So when I started this, I was just working on with a Chinese grammar written by a Dominican with the name Francisco Varo. This was actually the starting point of the preparation of this lecture. It is the final page of this grammar of Mandarin of Chinese. It's from the last decades from the 17th century. And as you can see, I zoomed in that particular section at the end of the book. Que si quien aprende un oficio mecánico, who learns a mechanical oficio, tiene necesidad de directorio. They will need a guideline, you can call this a guideline, a directorio, y instrumentos para conseguir su intento, cuanto más el que aprende extraño idioma tiene necesidad de algunas reglas, with exclamation marks. So if you are learning a mechanical art, think about anything you can imagine which you can make with your hands. But also in art, you can think about poiesis. You make something, a product, it is an art. And you have also mechanical arts and other arts. And there's, of course, a long existing classification of the artes liberales. You have also those who are called mechanical. And what do you need there? You need guidelines and you need instruments, útil linguistique. And of course, we have the necesidad de algunas. And I was just wondering, why algunas? Just some of them. It is not very much. Algunas is just 1 or 2 or 3 or 4. So I will come back to this topic, but this was my starting point. You need them, and maybe not so much of them. And this will also explain the decisions made later by the missionaries, and why do we find some grammars with many rules and others actually don't like them at all. So these algunas reglas, and you will need them, but of course there is more than that. There's not only the rule, but you need more. So this was the starting. This is another section from the same grammar from Francisco Varo, Arte de la lengua mandarina, and you find here about earlier sources. It is not the first grammar of this language. And then you find at the end of the last page, la frase es dificultosísima. The phrase is very difficult. Para cuya consecución es necesario la comunicación con ellos. Y también leer sus libros. And then you find, of course, information that's, communication is also important. And my question was actually, how many rules are given for leer sus libros, for understanding a language, or maybe for translating text into Chinese or from Chinese to Spanish? And you need also something else, and that's it's so difficult sometimes that you need also something else. And I will come back to this interesting topic later as well. So when I talk about arte liberales, you find, of course, in the same period and also before it later, arte de navegar, en que se contienen todas las reglas. So you have an art, you have mechanical arts, but you have also, in this case, arte de navegar. And you find reglas, declaraciones, secretos y avisos. So this was my second question. Sometimes you find in a grammar just a rule, and also avertissement or avisos. You have an opinion, but also conseil. You can find some suggestions how to use something. So this is not always a rule, and the missionaries were very productive in finding creative subtitles in the grammars, and sometimes they chose the term regla, but they have also avisos. It's also frequently used, but I see it here also in other arts. And just another example, it is one of the earliest printed texts in Catalan, the Arte aritmética, how to count, and then you find actually the same permettre la regla en practica, and I don't go to read the whole text, but on the second page you find aquí acaben las raons e regles des cambres des quals de tractar e donat sufficient a practica. So you have a practical, and here until here the rules, and then you must go to practice what you have learned. And that's actually as teaching still can work today. You give the rules or the theory, and then you have the practical parts of the story. And in pedagogical literature, this is always discussed. And in missionary grammars, you will find exactly the same. But sometimes, as I said, it is implicit. Sometimes it is explicit. They really tell the readers how to use the grammar and where to start with and how to think about the practical parts. If you know the rules, what can you do with that, and how can you acquire the necessary information? Is it enough to have just the rules? Maybe not, maybe it is. So actually I'm also thinking about one specific problem, and this is discussed in one of the few titles we have in Spanish works with the title Reglas. This is a fragment of Antonio de Nebrija. He is, of course, very famous as a lexicographer. His dictionaries, Spanish, Latin, and Latin and Spanish. Of course, as a grammarian. And it's maybe less known among grammarians that he also wrote Reglas de Ortografía. And the grammar does not have, in that sense, the title the word reglas, but he gives this in his title Reglas de Ortografía. I actually should give the first page, this was not in the right order. Reglas de Ortografía, this is the title of this text. And then you find the rules, and it's just an example. I could give any other example. There is a chapter, and here the author is explaining regla, traspasamos una regla, and it is about how to spell nuestro amigo. Then you have actually a topic which is interesting for prosody, for reading poetry. You must count the syllables, and if you want to count the syllables, you must know the phonological rules, and then you must know also the spelling. Those contractions existed in many texts, and there was a lot of chaos. And here we find some rules again, reglas, how to approach a problem like nuestro amigo. This is a very important problem because what they call syncopa, it is a very serious problem for many missionaries. And if you write this book, a word, if you hear this word, how can you spell that? Just put them apart and just representing the words as they should be? Or do you have to listen to the pronunciation and just try to be as close as the spelling conventions can tell us? So if you, nuestro amigo, if you pronounce that way, you can say, if I write it this way, maybe I pronounce it the wrong way. And if is it the sound or is it the script? Is it the spelling or how you conceive a word? And of course, Spanish had a tradition. It was not standardized yet, but those Amerindian language, no one knew actually if someone was talking too fast, or maybe it was just a dialect where you can find a lot of syncopas and others don't have them. And this was a very serious problem for the description of those languages, because there was no norm, there was no regla, and for some it was very important to prescribe the rules and how can we write something which is actually different from what we perceive. And if we write it correctly, maybe they pronounce it the wrong way. And of course, if it's your native language, you cannot say that according to our modern view, but of course, it is still a very relevant question if we hear today varieties which are not standard varieties in the modern languages, of course. They write as we are taught at school, but maybe you pronounce it also differently. So this is about one of the few texts which had the title Reglas, and I also want to stress the word texts which have the title Gramática. This is a later edition for Antonio de Nebrija. And just, I want to remind the prologue, and probably most of you know it very well because it's so much quoted everywhere. But this is the image that, as occurred with Greek, as occurred with Latin, the same applies to Spanish. Before our age, hasta es nuestra edad, anduvo suelta y fuera de regla. There was no rule, there was no standard form. Spelling could be very different, and of course, this was one of the main reasons to write this Castilian grammar. But here again, the idea is that a language cannot have rules if it's not written or reducir a arte, reducir a artificio. That means reduced to arte, and if it's arte, there must be a rule, and those rules actually can tell us that a standard form can be found in that case. And Nebrija actually considers from that moment Spanish as a dead language, as Latin. He wanted to fix the language so that there will be no more changes, because this is the rule, and the practical part actually can vary, but this will never have the same prestige because it is not fixed. So this is the second citation from the same prologue from the Castilian grammar. They are talking about there was literature, novelas, historias, and they were all with mentiras and errores, with lies and errors. And then you find the concept of reducir in artificio, and okay, at the end you find todavía quedan en una uniformidad. So this is really what was needed. One uniform spelling, standard spelling actually for the entire language, in order to fix it. So you find again some observation. I don't read the entire text, but I marked the final one. Si no vienen desde niños a la de aprender por uso, podrán la más aída saber por esta mi obra. So this is actually an opinion, and you can find it in missionary grammars as well. But many have a different opinion. What about the Nebrija? What about children? What about use? You can use a language as your native language from your mother or father or anyone else. And then you have, of course, the rules, and how can we write a grammar if you have that maybe a conflict between the two. And this is actually a topic which is discussed later by many missionaries. And today you will see some more fragments which are talking about this native language which you have learned, and something is different, which is not based on the usage, but you learned it with the grammar, with the rules. So already a long time ago, I was also wondered, there are some texts which really deserve our attention, and I will come back to this. So this was actually the whole introduction. There was artificio, I talked about the artes mechanicas, and now we have here a work, and it was already for me fascinating, that Blancas de San Jose is one of the earliest grammar of Tagalog from the Philippines, and his grammar has a completely different way of presenting the data. There is one short introduction. It is just 24 folios. We can call this rudiments, or maybe an introduction to the parts of speech system. So for anyone who thinks about the grammaire étendue, it's still the Latin-based structure, and okay, the answers are given. If you want to find an equivalent for an adverb or for an optative or anything else, you have the accidents linked to the parts of speech. And then it's actually the end of that very short introduction. And the titles are not called libro, they are not capítulos, they are not chapters, but it is quite strange. They have the title lección, lesson. The word circulated in Europe as well, but the many missionary grammars I have, I found the lessons much later. So apart from the rules, you must also link the term, the concept of regla with ejercicio, of course with excepción, and and of course, what is a lesson and what is an exercise and what kind of exercises were actually produced. And of course, it can be interesting to study why is this called a lesson and not a chapter. So this is quite different, and the most interesting part, of course, is the almost 300 pages, and it is printed in a very small letter. They are devoted most to roots and particles, but this is the title, Libro de las Reglas. So here there are no reglas actually in the part of speech system, and the other very big part, they are only rules and not linked to the parts of speech. So this is something which I took as starting point, one of the starting points for this lecture, and this is my introduction. So now I want to talk a bit more about the titles you can find as titles of grammars in Spain. And of course, you find Arte, you find also sometimes Instituciones, you find Introduction, there are Spanish and French titles here. You find also Méthode pour entendre facilement, you find Advertencias, even like something like that. So if you compare those titles with missionary grammars, you will see here some more, Curioso, Método, Espejo, a mirror, you have the Secretos de la Gramática, Grammaire, you find so many, a key, sometimes used in Arte breve, arte compendiosa, compendio, you can find those words as titles. But the subtitles, it is not a standard way to approach that, because all those texts are based, or most of them, on a certain grammar which can be Nebrija or someone else, and there is not one model in this sense. You find notas, observaciones, notables, avisos, but also reglas as subtitle, and sometimes it is a separate section, independent from the other parts, and sometimes the notables or avisos, you find them after each topic, sometimes marked with an asterisk, and it means like a note or footnote, an observation, a remark. But some grammars actually put the reglas always together and put them at the end. So this is also, I can say, more or less a tradition in Mesoamerica, as far as we can talk about traditions. But many took a grammar of a later edition of Antonio de Nebrija, where you also find those reglas in the last section of the grammar. So there is sometimes a systematization, and as I always say, you always find other examples which have a different internal structure. You can call this the architecture of the grammar, talking about not only the titles, but also the subtitles of the sections. But reglas can be expanding all the time, so that can lead to some different solutions, as we shall see later. So what do we find in the New World? And then you find a different proportion. Sometimes you find indeed método, but most actually have the title Arte de la lengua, and then you can find the name of the glottonym. And of course you have also the word Gramática, but it is less frequently used. You have sometimes also combinations as Arte de la Gramática, you find Arte y Gramática, sometimes Arte o Gramática. So sometimes it looks like something different. Is it a grammar or is it Arte and a grammar? If you say it's both, it can be a synonym. And I try to get a more systematic view of what kind of decisions were done made. But as I said, it is sometimes just a variation. I did not find always the solution. And if everything is based on Nebrija, it surprises us that we do not find so often that Reglas, as Reglas de Ortografía, and his Instituciones or Introducciones, you have both in Latin. We do not find so frequently this as a title in a missionary grammar. And I said Nebrija was the example, so it is a difference between them. So there is anything Ars Grammaticae, you find also Latin titles of words written in Latin. And I do not have the intention to read them all, but you will find most of them are also sometimes quite different. Compendio, you find sometimes something completely different. Paralismo in the middle, and luces de l'automie, the lights. And today I also shall take a little look at Lo imposible vencido. And you find different titles, but those are most linked to also the inclusion of religious texts, for instance. So you can find Arte, Gramática, y confessionario with a confessionary, and sometimes it's just noticia. But today our topic is Reglas, and you've already seen the name Neve y Molina. It is the first printed grammar of Otomi. It is not the first printed text in that language, but it is quite late. It's from the 18th century. And there we find clearly the word reglas in the title. I will come back to this later. So there is a discussion also in Spain, and it is a bit of simplification, but I can say Baldes and the others. Baldes is he wrote a dialogue, diálogos, and this is not the grammar of Spanish, but here we can find his view, which was circulating in that period. Porque es la más regia cosa del mundo da reglas, en donde cada plebeyo y vulgar piensa que puede ser maestro. So the word plebeyo and vulgar is used, and this can be translated often to vulgar or something, but sometimes it's just the common speech. It is not always negative, but it is the way the people talk, and we call this is a regia cosa del mundo. It's difficult to give rules, and then the answer is aunque sea fuera de propósito, os suplico me digáis a quién llamáis plebeyos. Well, who are those people? Bajo ingenio and poco juicio, those are plebeian and vulgar people. Y si son altos de linaje, and if they are noble or something, or very rich people, are they also vulgar people? And then you see here, aunque sean cuán altos y cuán ricos quisieren, they can be as rich as they want, as they wish, but in my opinion, they will always be plebeyos and no son altos de ingenio y ricos de juicio. So this has to do with the idea of what is the linguistic usage of those people. Can we pay attention to those varieties, and actually can we give rules for also other varieties of speech which are not considered as the most elegant way to talk? And this was a discussion in that period, and a polemic, even a debate. I can call it maybe better a debate. And others were actually more closely linked to Nebrija's view that you must fix the language, and just as if it is already a dead language, and you must fix the rules. And if you are going to talk a different way, that's your problem, but then it will not be the original language anymore. So he does not accept the linguistic change and linguistic variation. There's just one standard, and there are only rules for that kind of language and not for the other one, the spoken varieties. So the next step was actually for me to look at some grammars why you find sometimes a lot of observations about irregularities. And if it's something is irregular, it has an implication that other forms are regular. So there are reglas for regular features, but others are sometimes reglas are also given for irregular features. And the languages I have seen until today, they can be very complex, of course, and it was the same problem for those who studied them in that period. And sometimes I wondered, what does this author maybe understood of the complexity of a certain topic? And if he maybe understood it completely, the second question is, did he really had the intention or the objective to describe those features as something which can be very complicated for the student as well? So sometimes the solution is to simplify a little bit the complex problem, in order to just to start with, yeah, let's say a low threshold for the beginners, and then you can give the real complex problems, maybe the rules later, when you have already advanced students. But in other cases, I have seen also that in many languages, the scholars are until today struggling with a lot of very difficult problems in linguistics. And then, of course, it is also plausible that many problems were not understood at all. And maybe this led to something irregular. And this was for many missionaries also a decision to say, it is so difficult, I can not find the rule, I don't see the rule, there are even more exceptions than rules, so what can I do in a grammar? So in that case, I have one case study, and I took the plural in Arabic, as all probably know, all those who are a bit familiar with other Semitic languages, or maybe you have something like template morphology, and the plural forms can be made with suffixation in Arabic, but there is also another way, and this is quite complex. There's not one way to make the plural form. And this is just yeah, from the internet to have some examples. Sahib and ashab, you find a broken plural. But the next one, Sadiq, you have Asdika, you have then a completely different plural form. And of course, there is also plural with suffixation. So my question was, what did the missionaries actually do with all those complex problems? And this is one example from the earliest printed missionary grammar of the world. And this is the grammar written by Pedro de Alcalá. And it is Arte para ligeramente saber la lengua arábiga, together with the vocabulista. And of course, if you talk about plural forms, you will also find the necessary information in the dictionary, because you must also find there how to make the plural form of a substantive noun. So here is the first edition for 1505, and a few months later appeared already a second edition, and this is the emendada, añadida, segundamente imprimida. It's the second edition, and from that part, yeah, this version, I took just an excerpt. You find, of course, the word regla y doctrina, muy provechosa. This is actually almost a synonym with the doctrine, grammatical doctrina, regla y doctrina. And then he's going to discuss here somewhere in his grammar the singular and the plural, and actually there are two, but there's also a dual. But of course, the language described here, it is the spoken variety of Granada. It is Andalusian or the Arabic variety in Granada. You find the plural forms here, and then actually it stops after 4 lines, and then you can see dificultosa cosa es, según dicen los. It's very difficult. Poder saber los plurales, to know the plural forms of the nouns. Por la mucha diferencia que hay. There is so much, there are so many different forms. Diferencia que hay, muchos nombres, y no se puede dar regla. There are no rules for that. Según ellos dicen, they even say that. They can speak it, they can know it. They have auctoritas, they are authority in that case. They could know this, they should know it, but there are no rules, and I don't go to give all those rules in my grammar. So here you find again the word el uso, and after this you find y no se puede dar regla, según ellos dicen común para todos, que sea más solo el uso ha de hacer maestros. You will be only a master after el uso. And this is also clearly demonstrating the limitations, or maybe probably we know more about Pedro de Alcalá, and probably his knowledge of Arabic was not that advanced in order to have a very good opinion about this. Many things he probably did not understand so very well, but actually he said, if you really want to know this, please just go to practice, and then you will learn the rules. And this is, of course, not a very a scientific approach, but it is the reality, and you find this very frequently in many missionary grammars around the world. When something is getting too difficult, okay, take some distance and just listen. Here another one. It is also a grammar of the spoken variety, in this case of Damascus, but it has also another part, and this is the literal or the literary language, and the official Arabic, and there you find algunas reglas de la literal. It is for that part you have the rules for reading the text correctly according to the classical Arabic terminology. But there's another one. It is en que se da suficiente noticia. It is the first part is most about the variety spoken in Damascus, and it has also some rules, but there are not really rules for the spoken variety in this case. He reserves the term reglas specifically for the prestigious variety, what you can call standard Arabic or classical Arabic. And here you find in this prologue, this text is from a bit the first decade or the last decade of the 17th century, beginning 18th century. It is written by a Franciscan who worked in the Middle East, and Arabic, also Arabic from Damascus, was also taught in Seville, in that place, and also in Rome. You could study as a missionary Arabic, but also the Greek variety of the Isle of Cyprus. And it was taught there, and here you find also some observations in the prologue. Hay de dicha lengua arabica gramática. There you have the grammar for the Arabic language, and of course we can call this grammatical literal. And then the author says at the bottom of the page, esta lengua vulgar arabica se tiene alguna variación según la variedad de los países. And you have there the variety spoken in all parts of the Arabic speaking world. Here you find the plural. Es tanta la variedad y tienen los nombres en estos plurales y ajenas hayan reglas y no admiten excepción. So there are some rules, and actually this priest was much more informed than Pedro de Alcalá, and he gives many forms which are really an attempt to have a kind of systematization of the broken plurals. He also used a term, but again we find at the end, para la práctica, okay, for the practice you must actually learn them by practice. So this is again more theory. There are more also rules. There are some rules, but they have also exceptions. And in this case, we see also in time that knowledge is also advancing, and this priest had also access to other works which also were from authors which were familiar with the Arabic linguistic tradition. So Pedro Alcalá was more ignorant in that sense. Probably he did not understand it. But here you find an author who was very much aware of the existence of broken plurals, but he will also say, just listen, and the practice will learn us actually how to use them and which word has which specific form and for the plural. So this is a talk about irregularities, and many languages were seen as so complex that they are actually, it will be impossible to conquer them. And here the author, another Jesuit, Manuel de Larramendi, is trying to demonstrate that also other languages like Basque in this case, they can be conquered as well. And he's also talking about rules and complexities of languages. So if something is very complex, a solution can be just ignore it, or just tell your learners that they have to listen carefully to the speakers. But you can also say this language is much easier than you think if you take a look at it. And this is another approach. If you can give rules for Latin, if rules for Greek, just think about the participles and the irregular forms you have there. And that's a real nightmare for the students. And he discovered in his Basque language, oh, this is unbelievable. It's so regular that you even do not exceptions. And he's not the only one with languages like Turkish or Mapuche, or other also agglutinative languages from the Americas. They can be complex according to us, but they show also very transparently the processes of suffixation, that actually, if you know those rules, you also will conclude very soon that there are not so many exceptions as you are used to in Latin grammar and Greek. So here you have one example. It's talk from this prologue from Vascuence. Hasta ahora han tenido por imposible, it was until today impossible to reduce it to método y reglas. There was no way to do that. It was impossible. It is so difficult you cannot find any rule in this language. But this author, he was also a native speaker of Basque. He was not ignorante, no, he was, yeah, even the doctors were actually struggling with this problem. And here you find, again, es la lengua más culta. It is not a barbarous language, because if a language does not have rules, if it does not have a script, or if it does not have any grammar, then it is often considered as a barbarous language. And of course, if there's contact between written prestigious variety and something else, they call this barbarous, because it comes from something, another element. It can be barbarismos, solecismos. It is a kind of influence from a language which is considered as barbarous or not culta elegante. But the author here demonstrates clearly this language is, before desacreditaban el vascuence de lengua inculta, it was barbarous, incapaz de arte, it was not even capable to have the rules. But here comes the lengua is the most culta, the most elegant, armoniosa, even we talk about in terms of harmony. And then you find here, arte método, reglas fijas, and you have a dictionary, and actually this is the way he presents the Basque language, and then he compares somewhere else the great regularity and the reglas, which are always actually valid without all those exceptions you have to learn for Greek and Latin. So the rule in this case is also used, the regla, in order to demonstrate that it can be documented, and actually the status of the prestige depends in this case of the existence or the non-existence of reglas fijas. And talking about difficult languages, Basque was considered as difficult, and it is still very difficult for us today. And other languages had also different problems, and here you find again how to learn and how to read those texts. And I will come back to this later, but here you find already an opinion, que no se contenten con leer uno y otro punto del arte, sino que le lean y con reflexión desde el principio hasta el fin, si quieren hacerse cargo de las reglas y de su conexión. This is an opinion. How can you read a grammar? Or maybe how can you teach a grammar? And we do not know so very much details about that. But we have grammars, and actually you find cross-references sometimes on page 2, then you find an observation, see chapter 8, and you go to chapter 8, you find an asterisk. Please see the rule on page 7. So this is going, you hop from the one part to the other one, and it can be even more complex than this. If you have a grammar and a dictionary, and maybe also 2 dictionaries, one translating from an indigenous language to Spanish, and the other one who translates the other direction. You find often in the grammar a reference to the dictionary, and dictionaries sometimes are also 2 dictionaries, the tesoro and the diccionario. In that case, you can find an example in the grammar with a rule, or maybe without a rule, but then you must go to the dictionary, the simple one, which translates from Spanish to, in this case, for instance, Guarani. And then you can also find this equivalent in the other part, and there you will find very detailed information of the use with examples, with exceptions, and also rules in the dictionary. So sometimes, of course, we have a grammar in our hands, but we say there are almost no rules. But of course, you must read it together with the dictionary. and use it all the time. And in the dictionary, you will find, again, a cross-reference, maybe go back to your grammar, and then you will find the next part which you will need. So for many missionaries, it was actually a good idea. Let's start with the first page and end with the last one. So this must be done first, and then this must be done final as the last topic, maybe the most difficult one for the advanced students. But if we are going to study this, we find also often orthography comes first with pronunciation, then morphology, and at the end syntax. But in many traditions, as we shall see today, autonomy has so many problems with pronunciation for the learners that they start to give first the reglas for the pronunciation, and then you go to something else. And you find also grammars who say, no, start from the beginning, learn the rules, and go to the practice later. And they see the rules actually as something completely independent, or as a kind of condition. You must do this first, you know the rules, and go then to something else. And I will have more examples today. Of course, there is here an example again from this Basque grammar with the almost Leipzig glosses hyphens for the separating also the morphemes in this case. So it was quite modern in that sense. It was absolutely not the first. It occurred also in other grammars. And here you find again, y más si se hace reflexión, if you really think about it, que todas estas reglas son comunes a todas las conjugaciones. So when do you have a rule? You have also, they are universal. And actually in this case, there's no place for irregularities. Regla must be común for all the conjugations. Regulares again, active, and then you find again this approach. No es menester más que recurrir a esta. You must know first all those rules here, and this language does not have so many irregularities. So this is again the idea of universal, of común. That is the status of a rule according to many grammarians. But we'll see soon in the Philippines that it's completely the opposite. It's not commune at all, just the idiosyncrasies can be discussed as a kind of peculiarity or something which is really different, or sometimes it's called idiotismo, or you can find modos de hablar, the way they speak, and it's different, of course, and in that case it has not the same claim of universality. Rules are sometimes presented as universal for this language, as common, común, and of course you find, as you will see later, different approaches. So this was my first part about Spain, and if I have the screen, I have my watch here. Okay, just check where I am. New Spain, of course, it is a very complex part of the world in the sense of linguistic variety. Until today, it was the same in the colonial period. And I already introduced the title of this grammar with the word reglas in the first place. And again, it is ortografía, so it looks very similar to what Antonio de Nebrija has for his Reglas de Ortografía, but it is not called Arte at the first place. It is first that one, reglas, and then you find Arte de idioma otomí. And also breve instrucción para los principiantes, etc. So here is a different title. It is not used only by this author, but it's not the rule. It is, let's say, an exception. So how you can find this kind of information in the prologue? Often you find the same opinion about Basque, that it was such a difficult language for the learners, and in this case it's not for this, the same reason as Basque, because Basque is relatively very simple phonology, but the repertory of the sounds and the vowels in Otomi are very complex. So this was considered as actually so difficult that you need tantos caracteres y figuras, as you can see it. It was a real problem for the printing house, the printing press, to develop so many different fonts or types, let's say, for the different letters, because it will cost a lot of money and a lot of energy, and they considered actually it as completely impossible. But there was another problem. If they tried to understand the the minimal pairs, how you can find also the different figures. Even if they asked this to the native speakers, they could not give a good answer. And then they said, if they do not know the rules, how can we write rules or develop a grammar? So it's, as happened for Basque, the same was said about Otomi, but now it was the phonological level, which was so complex for them that they said, it was the main question. The question could be raised, can we reduce this language to Arte? Does it have rules, reglas? And during centuries, this was considered, according to this author, as something completely impossible. But this title is not Lo imposible vencido, but what he tries to say is exactly the same as Larramendi said about Basque. It is possible, and then he gives this information about this language, and es disputa no leve entre los nativos de este idioma si se puede reducir a reglas su enseñanza. So even here, the natives are telling this missionary, is it actually possible to reduce this to, let's talk about the few letters we have for so few vowels. You need much more than that. And if you have them, you have an advanced alphabet, which will be still so complicated, because if you ask your neighbor or someone else, he will give a different pronunciation, and then we have the same problem. It is not fixed. What can you do? So even the natives said to him, is it possible to reduce, to reducir a reglas of this complex language like Otomi? Dicen que los indios en lo primitivo de este idioma they did not have any rules, as the Greeks and the Romans and the Spanish before the classical period, before the word grammars and before there was literature, there were no rules for this Otomi either. So they have something like, they always spoke this language, y hablan sin saber por qué regla. They did not have a rule. But they did. There was a language, but they didn't know the rules. So here a bit longer citation. Here it's about, you can learn it como para que los principiantes. I'm here on the left page in the middle. Bien instruidos en ellas pueden componer y hacer sus oraciones y periodos a los cuales, aunque les falte aquella armonía que tienen los nativos. So if you learn that language, if you are not a native, you will not have still, let's call it, armonía of the native speakers, pero esta después fácilmente la adquieren a costa de la práctica. And of course, after this grammar, this book, Reglas de Ortografía, you can go to practice it, and then a la manera que un niño gramático, a child, no luego que sabe y entiende el arte latino de Nebrija, puede sueltamente y con facilidad hablar el latín. So this was an interesting observation. You find also in other grammars that actually the grammar or the rudimenta or maybe the reglas, they are based on Nebrija, but that's only for children. So it's not enough to have just your rules. You must practice them, and you will acquire the real rules later, but not in the grammar itself. It was a niño gramático, they call it frequently. You find it quite frequently in these texts. So on the right page, you find again lo segundo, que aunque en lo primitivo de este idioma y demás de este reino no tuvieron los indios reglas a que sujetarse, no obsta eso a que después se inventen reglas ajustadas a las calidades y propiedades que en cada idioma se han observado. So there are now rules, and of course in this grammar he wants to demonstrate that it is the case. And then you must go, the second citation, ponerlas en práctica, ajustándolas en cuanto sea posible al uso. Again, the usage, and that's the most important part, but the same as opinion as we have seen before. So what is the role of the professor or the catedrático? We find seldom information about the way the professors actually were teaching their grammars. We know from some places that actually they just dictated read aloud the rules of a grammar, and the students actually wrote literally their own manuscripts derived from the lecture. And after the lecture, the teacher was still available, walking around, and then they could ask some questions if they, but the lessons were actually more or less the lectures based on the grammar and the rules, and just like that. But here we find something which is very interesting according to, it's very modern according to our view, but we must be very careful not to be too anachronistic to see it with our modern eyes. But you have the catedrático, hablarse cuanto es posible hablar. He must speak as much as he can. So there were other teachers probably who just were reading the grammatical rules, but the most important here, the catedrático, he must speak as much as he can. Y lo segundo, que los discípulos tuvieron tal memoria y comprensión que no perdieran ni un ápice, y no siendo esto posible, se hace preciso darles una norma o método por donde se rijan, estudiando y entendiendo bien sus reglas. So here you have a different approach. If you compare this picture of an ideal teacher or a professor, a catedrático, teaching at a university in Mexico, there is a different one. I'm sorry, this is Manuel Perez. He wrote 3 texts, Arte, grammar, and also 2 religious texts. And here you find a different opinion where he tells his learners that he was actually 21 años, 21 years he was teaching this language. In this case, it is Nahuatl, and also 16 de haber leído sus reglas en la Real Universidad. So this was actually the most important way to teach, according to Perez, just leyendo las reglas. At the university, you do the rules, and outside the classroom, actually, you will really acquire the sufficient skills for communication, etc. So here you have a completely different view, because Neve y Molina for Otomi said the most important thing is that also the catedrático has to talk with them. They must speak and just think about the huge differences between those 2 languages as well. A polysynthetic, very complex, more from the morphological and syntactic point of view. And maybe Otomi is more simple on that level, but very complex in pronunciation. And that led to so many confusions. So speaking and acquiring the real skills to pronounce all those vowels was seen or considered as much more important than the other parts, which you can learn outside. So there are also some opinions. This is again from Manuel Perez. Hay mexicanos nativos y hay mexicanos reglistas. Some who know the language by as native speaker, as native tongue, and others who are mexicanos reglistas, those who know the rules. And it's very interesting to see here. Estos son los que la saben por arte. They have acquired this language with an arte, the grammar. Los nativos es cierto que hablan con más facilidad. They speak more easily, more fluently, facilidad y copia with a rich vocabulary. Pero los reglistas con más perfección. They are really, they speak the language. Actually, they know, not speak, it is saben. It is, they know the language with perfection. Because, as the logic says, they have been thinking about it, conocimiento reflejo, about what they are saying, y por qué lo dicen, and why they are saying it that way. They can explain that because they have the rules. And of course, this is interesting because those missionaries as Paris also created a Christian vocabulary and made their own creations in that case, created neologisms. And if someone asks, why do you use this word? They had an answer, because they know the rules. And they said, if you just ask in Spain, why do we have this grammatical feature? You will not get an answer, or maybe an answer which is not so satisfactory, or maybe they are just saying, okay, this is the way I speak it. It's not another explanation, because this is Spanish and I'm speaking that. And okay. The same opinion anyone will have seen this in her or his life. And here you find already an opinion which is also frequently recorded or documented in this period, that actually the priests are much better speakers than the natives, because they have the rules, they have sometimes a standard variety, and this variety was given a high prestige, and the others were just some ignorant people and they could not explain. And even if you ask them, you will get an answer which is not so satisfactory. So rules are for the learned, and the other things are, you don't need rules, or maybe you don't have any rules for the spoken varieties. But later in the Philippines, as I say, you will see something completely different. Here again, the Arte de la lengua caída, it's an anonymous Jesuit, almost the same period as Manuel Perez, the 18th century. And you find here conforme a las reglas, again, in the subtitle. And here you find also the same opinion about Arte nebricense, talking about prolijidad, porque aquellos rudimentos son para niños. You have just for children the rules as you learn Latin as a child. And later maybe at college, and then you learn the rules. And of course this is not enough, because a missionary must be able to do much more than that. Sujetos, maestros, and they must be able to translate, traducción del catecismo, you must be a translator, you must translate the Doctrina Christiana, and there is so much more than only just those rules, reglas for children. So this is yeah, something you can find also quite frequently in missionary sources, that it is not the most important stage in your process of acquisition, second language acquisition. The rules are just for the beginning, to have an ID, and then the most important thing come later. Arte de lengua tepehuana, again with a title which is much more than also a dictionary, a confessionary, and here is the last example from Mesoamerica. This is a language from the Uto-Aztec linguistic family from the Northwest, and there are 5-6 important grammars, all written by Jesuits, in this case Rinaldini. And then you have again y de esta suerte advertir en las reglas que se han dado en el arte de esta lengua y de reducidas a práctica. So here you find again much information about the practical part. And how do they do this? They give regla, and also give the translation, and also in this case the wrong translation, following the syntax, the literal translation from Tepehuana. In this case it makes a kind of Spanish like cual persona hombre se hizo y Santa Maria de ahí nació, and that does not sound very well. So there are rules, and with Spanish actually they are telling, for Spanish we have different rules, so they are not universal, and every language has specific rules, and also sometimes called modos a hablar. And they are also creating reglas which are not universal just for Spanish, but you must say here it is reducidas a práctica. It's not reducida a arte, but it is reducida a práctica. The rules are just related to the practice, or the real how those syntactic structures are represented in this language. So the next part is about the Philippines, and as I said already a long time ago, I was a bit impressed by the word arte y reglas. It is according to our modern view, from the less attractive work, talking in terms of the printing style. It's a very small letter, a dense letter, no paradigms at all. It's just information, but it is so interesting because it has this small arte, and then almost 300 pages with the libro de las reglas. The rules are given there, and not talking anymore about the parts of speech, not at all. Particles, ligaduras, you can find also adverbs, but also many, we can call them anything you like, suffixes, it is about infixes, it's about derivation, it's about morphology, it is about anything, but also the the pragmatic part of the story, which usually falls outside a normal classical grammar. With pragmatics, I referring to the word order, and this is actually not studied so sufficiently or thoroughly in that period, because if you change the word order, actually you are talking about rhetoric. You can think about a different approach in rhetoric. You can change the word order for rhetorical or pragmatic reasons, and this has to do with information structure, but that falls outside the grammar. But in these texts, now these I talk in plural, it is absolutely true that you find this aspect in many grammars of the Philippines, that you find those particles or related to pragmatics and also to anything you can imagine which is not in the usual parts of speech system. It falls outside, and here the author decided to have, as I said, Arte first, and then you get the Reglas. Here an example from how this grammar is presented, algunas advertencias, how to use it. It has also abbreviations for any part of speech, also with how to read this grammar. And as I said, it is very dense letter and difficult to find something. And it has a lot of cross references. As I said, you must hop from one point to the other one. You find here so many rules. It is almost 300 pages, but the author tries to help the reader. Just look chapter 8 and go to rule 1 and go to chapter 5, chapter 9, and you see all the references where the same topic or comparable topics are discussed. This does not have anything to do anymore with the Nebrija-based model, and this is called Libro de las Reglas. And actually, when you study them, you can try to get to a certain systematization. But as I did somewhere else also talking about other grammars with the term particula, it is not consistent. It is not always or almost never systematic. But you will find here really the information which is needed, because the reglas, they were not sufficient. It stops at the beginning, and then the real learning process is starting here with those reglas. The same tradition can also be found in the dictionaries there. They are also completely different compared to what we find in Mesoamerica. They are all based on Nebrija, more or less, or maybe this first printed dictionary of San Buenaventura has been inspired by Molina and also Nebrija. But actually you find the same, what we can find in those grammars. For instance, you have here it's just a selection, because on the next page we will find even 10 or 20 more translations of the verb pescar, pescar, to fish. And as in the grammars, you find a lot of information here, equivalents, also usage, examples. And in the grammars, actually, of the Philippines, you find not only a translation or a paradigm compared with what you can find in Nebrija. In Molina's adaptation of Nebrija, you find most frequently one-to-one translations with equivalents, maybe one example, maybe a second comment. That is maybe a metaphor or something like that, but then it stops. It's still a dictionary which looks very much like Antonio de Nebrija. But here you see something completely different. You find just pescar, and that depends on how you fish or with what kind of instrument. You can do it at the seashore, in a river. You can have a fishing rod. You can have a fish hook if you want, and you have also both a caña y anzuelo. You have also anzuelo grueso. You can do it at a river, the rio, the playa. You find much practical information in these dictionaries, and the same occurs in the grammars. You find not only the usual part of speech, and you find in the reglas mainly also expressions, metaphorical uses. You find insults, you find really practical translations of a certain expression, linked with one entry. And as I say, you must not take a look only at the grammar. You find something comparable in the lexicographical tradition. So here again, there is an example from Libro de las Reglas. And here I have a second one, and maybe this will take too much time. This is another observation of another author of the Philippines, Magdalena. Again, maestros, I start only with the last section here. Sin estudio de ella, alcanzan en poco tiempo lo que sin estas reglas tengo por moralmente imposible. Different from many places in the world where there was a university, were universities, of course, in Manila, but not outside Manila. And there was a kind of classroom setting, as far as we know, in Macau, and there was, of course, in other places in Goa and probably in some places, but not so much in the Philippines. There were universities in Mexico, in the Andes, but usually there were teachers available, and there are many places where there are no teachers at all. So you must study this language, in most cases, as a solitary occupation, and you must do it yourself. And actually, sin estas reglas, it was tengo por moralmente imposible. But then he says again, muchos años que si bien los naturales la hablan con elegancia, the native speakers are speaking with elegance, y propiedad, and no pueden dar reglas, they cannot give the rules. And we, como nosotros, no podemos dar reglas generales. We can even not tell the learner Spanish about the rules. They are just for the grammarians. So here's a parallel with what we have seen in Mexico. And here again, y no ser toda una, sino que el indio en la práctica suele sincopar las voces o añadirles a sus finales alguna sílaba o dicciones. So this actually, if you try to learn a language, foreigner will always have an accent. They pronounce it very badly, but they are reglistas, and even this can be, there is an excuse for that, because if you know the rules, you can explain what you are doing. But here it's even the natives themselves pronuncian mal, and also with confusion. If I ask something and the next day maybe I get a different answer, and even say some people say, missionaries, that if I just have an example, if I ask it one day later, the language has already been changing, because the same person is giving, if he pronounces E or I don't hear the difference probably, and then he blames the informant in that case, or the assistant, as we can call it in modern fieldwork, that the pronunciation can even change every day, so you never know that. So they pronounce it badly. There's confusion about that. Barbarismo incapaz, and it's frequently found they are not able to give the rules. Finally, I want to cite some results of a very interesting study of another Filipinian grammar from the lengua Pangasinan. It is from the 90s of the 17th century, and this is from the editor and also the author of the introduction, the very large introduction, Joaquín Sueiro Gustel and María Dolores Ribeiro Lema. And I cite this because I don't think there is still a lot to do, but it is a very good attempt to get to a certain systematization of all those reglas in these Filipinian grammars. And what kind of information can we find there? So there is a systematization here based mainly on the introduction of this edition of Pangasinan grammar. Grammar is not only grammar, as I repeat here, this Andres Lopez, I'm talking about another Filipinian language, it's not Tagalog with Pangasinan. And here you find, again, a grammar which also has observations about poetry, prosody, it has pragmatics, it is about information structure, it has translation theory, stylistics, rhetoric, and of course there is some reflection about theory and practices, usage. And in this case, you find, according to our view, a very modern approach of what we can call information structure. There is here a rule, and always called regla, 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 and those are not linked to grammar at all. They are linked to what we today call information structure. You have oración, busca el libro con esta luz en la celda, puede tener uno de tres intentos. So we know all, we have questions. What are you looking for? El libro can be, here you exactly talk about topicalization and focus and focalization. With what kind of instrument, with what did you try to find it? Con esta luz, it was with the light. Or you can ask the question, where? And then the answer would be, it was in the cell. En la celda was it where I. So you have here exactly what we study today in pragmatics and also information structure. Also think about all those cleft constructions in French and other languages. And here, according to our view, it's a very modern approach. You find a very detailed explication. The first intento and the second intento, que se busque con esta luz, and not with something else. And the tercero puede ser que se busque en la celda, precisamente, y no en otra parte. It was in the cell where I did this. So many rules are not linked to the normal rules we find. We call it normal as Nebrija presented it, but the rules are really linked to usage, to the practical part, and not to the theoretical part in that case. How you must apply it, what can you find in a language, and not just the rules. You can do that at the beginning. You need some time for that, as children do some Latin, and then the most serious part of the story is all in the rules, in the reglas. So it's actually almost the end. You have one part Arte, the other is reglas, and this is a citation from Suero Gustel. And in his classification, I just took it from his book, you find a kind of typology of the reglas. And the same author has also studied about the typology of the ejemplos, the examples. So what kind of examples do we have in order to demonstrate some features in the language or grammatical information with an illustration with examples? And in other cases, you have also information just to give some translations for religious terms or religious citations, or for the catechism or the Doctrina Christiana. It is also not only teaching grammar, but sometimes they will also demonstrate how to say a certain word or a concept in a native language, which is so necessary for the mission. So you have the estructura básica, the main structure is, I will not translate all those examples. Reglas with exceptions, this is kind of typological approach, so I think he has done this very well, so there's no need to translate it all. Reglas que describen variaciones geográficas, are rules also linked to geographic diatopical varieties. Reglas que recogen anti-ejemplos, you have also examples and also anti-ejemplos, okay, contra-ejemplo. Reglas con estructura adversativa, this is that, but there is something else. You find this kind of type, another type of regla. Reglas con referencias intratextuales, and reglas con ejemplos complementarios, copia de, and this actually kind of attempts to have a systematic organization of all those hundreds of reglas you can find in this grammar of, and they are numbered continuously throughout for each book. And a book is a kind of chapter, and for every chapter you will find 90 or 100 rules, reglas, and there are 4 books, there are more or less 400 rules in that sense. And other texts prefer just to go until 10, and then we have another chapter with, again, numbering from 1 to 10. But if we count also the amount, the number of those reglas, we are talking about 300 or 400 at least. So you have also some explicit voice, also the opinion of the author himself, and ejemplos contextuali, a rule with an example and a certain context, and those contexts are also very closely linked to the dictionaries. As you have seen, there are examples. Sometimes they say just listen to the native or go to this dictionary, then you find a real example linked to a certain rule. And here you find again my conclusion. What I try to do is to give some tendencies, two parts of the world, starting with Spain, but we have seen some grammars where the regla was actually used in the context of autonomy, and a language which was seen as very complex on the phonological level, the pronunciation. And the other part was about the Philippines. And we have seen that the way the rules are presented and also used in those grammar can vary very much. They can be linked to the as a prestige question, that a language has only prestige when it has rules, and if it does not have rules, it is a barbarous one. And the other approach was more linked to the practice, and rules were not for the practice but for the theory. But then the authors started to develop their own rules for the spoken varieties, for the usage or the pragmatic level of the language, and of course the meaning. But it is much more than that. Stylistics, you find also metaphorical usage, you find also insults, as I said, anything which is not according to the traditional model, regla, in the sense of a humanist grammarian as Antonio de Nebrija. So again, we have seen the regla and the practica. If you know the rule, you have to practice. The rule can be the most important thing to start with, but okay, this was maybe for children. And others say, just listen to the natives or go to my dictionary. You cannot rely sometimes on the natives themselves because they don't know the rules. But in those Filipinian grammars, you have seen there was a very important place for the practical part. And they have also rules as a normal grammar has. So here again, the first citation where I started with, oficio mecánico tiene necesidad de directorio. It's necessary, really. We need them and those rules. We need instruments. And of course, cuanto más el que aprende extraño idioma, tiene necesidad de algunas reglas. This more or less is my conclusion, that most texts we have discussed can be contextualized, or they confirm actually opinion as it has been formulated by Francisco Varo with this phrase, we need those rules, but the real practice comes outside the grammar, maybe outside the classroom, but not in this specific book you have in your hand. It is in my dictionary or outside the door, and then you will know the rules. And some are trying, as I said, to give also rules for all those spoken varieties, or you can call them modos de hablar, maneras de hablar, or idiotismos, or sometimes nahuatlismos or pangasinismos. They are so different, but they have also their rules. That they are equal. They are just like Latin, or even better than Latin and Greek, as the author of Basque was trying to convince us. So this is, I think it's maybe time for a discussion. Thank you very much for your attention. And of course, it is a selection. It is always with a limited, I cannot claim universality. The corpus is too big, but I hope you could learn something of this part of the story. So thank you very much for your attention.
Merci beaucoup, Otto, pour cette superbe présentation, cette promenade dans tout le monde hispanique et néo-hispanique, si on peut dire. Et bravo pour avoir bouclé la boucle et d'être revenu à ton point de départ, c'était superbe. Je vois qu'il y a plein de questions. Je commence dans l'ordre des vignettes, peut-être. C'était des bravos ou c'était des questions? Daniel Candel qui a levé la main. Ton micro, Daniel, je pense.
Voilà, c'est bon?
C'est bon, oui, on t'entend.
Merci de me laisser la parole tout de suite. Merci beaucoup à Otto pour cet exposé très, très intéressant. Je pense qu'on pose les questions en français?
Oui.
Ou en anglais, oui. Alors, au tout début, ce qui m'a étonné, là, vous parliez de mentir, ce sont deux questions détail. Hein. Mentiras y errores, quoi. Des lies, des mensonges. Ça m'intéresserait de savoir à quel moment, pourquoi on parle de mensonges. Je n'ai pas bien suivi ça. Et la deuxième chose, c'était les rules for irregular features. C'était la planche numéro 21. Reglas also for irregular features. What are these rules? Quelles sont ces règles pour des anomalies, c'est ça?
Donc, c'est 21.
Original. La deuxième, c'était la planche 21, si j'ai bien compté.
Oui, le deuxième, c'est 21. Je peux commencer. Ah, c'est Valdés. Ah oui. La première était sur le terme mensonge. Ça vient de Antonio de Nebrija.
Ah oui, d'accord.
Mais je ne sais pas, je ne connais pas la source d'où vient le mot mentiras dans ce cas.
Ah,
mais peut-être les poètes, on peut les considérer comme les personnes avec beaucoup de mentiras, mensonges.
Ah oui, les poètes, oui, d'accord.
Les poètes, oui, c'est une opinion assez générale, mais je ne connais pas exactement la source d'où vient le mot dans ce cas d'Antonio de Nebrija. Et la deuxième question était 21, c'est de Valdés, porque es la más recia cosa.
Des règles pour des irrégularités.
Régularité, mais je ne vois pas le mot régulier ou irrégulier dans le...
J'ai noté also for irregular features. Est-ce que... Ou alors c'est moi qui ai mal compris, je ne sais pas.
Quand je parlais peut-être de l'arabe.
Oui.
Oui. Donc, pour nous, il y a un certain logique aussi avec la formation du pluriel en arabe. Et on peut formuler les règles qui sont aussi encore régulières. Mais hors de la régularité, on trouve aussi dans quelques langues quelques phénomènes qui ne sont pas irréguliers, qui sont complètement différents. Donc, quand on peut formuler quelques règles pour les irrégularités,
oui.
Pour les exceptions, on peut encore parler de quelques règles. Je crois que je voulais dire ça pour les missionnaires. La formation de l'arabe était irrégulière. Pour Alcala, il n'a pas vu bien le système de, according to the modern terminology, the template morphology, avec le schème, comme Madame Matar nous va expliquer. Il y a un schème, aussi avec les formes qui sont assez complexes, mais aussi on trouve dans une langue peut-être une comparaison, comment on peut classifier les verbes dans les langues ottomanes, zapotèques, les complications se trouvent non pas dans la terminaison, mais c'est surtout la consonne initiale. Là, on trouve beaucoup d'irrégularités, mais pour beaucoup de missionnaires, c'était un défi, voir les irrégularités aussi. Et quelquefois, on ne le voyait pas et on disait seulement, ce n'est pas irrégulier. Mais il y a toujours, presque toujours, un chapitre dédié à les irrégularités.
Merci
C'est encore dedans le modèle, mais hors de l'irrégularité, il y a autre chose qui ne peuvent pas être classées comme irrégularité.
Merci beaucoup.
And one final observation, it can be very silly. In Chinese, you will find the irregular comparatives, and then they say you have bonus melior, it is not bonius, bonior, and it is not bonius, it is bonus melior optimus. So now we are studying the irregular forms in Chinese, and in Chinese it's not regular at all. And then they put that in they see it as irregular because it is, as the book tells us, it's not the target language, but in the source language, in this case Latin, it's irregular. Merci pour la question. Donc, le mensonge, je ne sais pas d'où vient l'information il connaissait très bien les auteurs de l'Antiquité. Chez les anciens, probablement, on trouve peut-être la même chose en parlant des poètes. C'est mensonge. Platon, je crois, je ne suis pas trompé avec ça, que Platon dit la même chose sur le mensonge et les poètes.
Ah oui, d'accord.
Oui, je crois que c'est très fréquent.
Merci beaucoup.
Merci Daniel. Je vois qu'il y a une question de Carla. Je crois, oui, ton micro, merci.
Oui, bonjour à tous. Merci pour cette super présentation très intéressante. J'aimerais bien juste rebondir sur la question de Daniel, sur les irrégularités, les mensonges et tout ça. En fait, je n'ai pas pu tout suivre parce que j'ai eu des problèmes de connexion, mais je ne sais pas si tu as parlé de s'il y a un lien entre ces irrégularités et ce qui est la variation. C'est-à-dire, par exemple, dans le cas de ton livre de Manuel Pérez, il parle beaucoup de la langue pure et il donne des exemples contre ce qui n'est pas pur. Donc, du coup, comme un exemple de dire ça c'est irrégulier, c'est plutôt l'exception, mais dans des autres grammaires dont tu as travaillé, là, est-ce que tu peux observer un lien entre ces variations et le fait de les lier avec des irrégularités, des impurités, voilà, des choses comme ça?
Il y a deux groupes. Quand il y a une variété géographique, on parle dans quelques cas d'une exception. Autrefois, on le voit comme aussi une autre règle que nous avons appris pour cette variété. Maintenant, je donne une règle pour l'autre. Donc, le prestige de l'observation, peut-être c'est seulement dans quelques remarques, une remarque. Pour les autres, c'est peut-être une observation. Et Pérez, il marque ça avec un astérix parce que c'est une chose nouvelle chose qui n'ont pas vu les autres, les prédécesseurs ou les exemples. Et après ça vient l'astérix. Et dans ce cas, c'est la variation géographique, mais il ne donne pas le mot règle dans ce cas. Les règles se trouvent aussi à la fin de la grammaire. Mais là, on trouve aussi information quelquefois, mais ce n'est pas toujours consistant. Quelquefois, il donne une autre règle, mais quelquefois, la règle, c'est comme ça, mais j'ai écouté autre chose, tierra caliente, ou chautla de la salle, où il apprenait la langue, la variété qu'il veut décrire aussi. Donc, c'est un mélange un peu, mais les règles viennent à la fin de la grammaire. Et c'est assez consistant, la présentation des règles. Mais c'est aussi le terme nota. Et notable, nota, en lieu de... quelquefois c'est glossa, on trouve nota, et on trouve aussi comme titre de chaque chapitre le mot règle, regla. Cordoba fait la même chose pour la zapothèque, c'est toujours regla, regla, regla. Mais autre tradition, c'est plus ou moins nota. Mais ça vient aussi de quelques autres éditions d'Antonio de Nebrija, de Luis de la Cerda, de 1599, c'est la première édition. Après, tout va changer. Aussi pour le nord du Mexique, il y a un autre modèle, autre version, qui n'est plus Nebrija. C'est complètement différent, mais encore avec le nom Nebrija. Et là, on trouve les différences entre nota et regla, et peut-être un autre titre pour les remarques. Dans ce cas, c'est plus général en parlant de ça. Ce sont aussi des remarques, observations, avisos, avertissements. C'est aussi quelque chose que nous pouvons trouver.
Merci. Je vois qu'on a deux questions, une de Madiane et une de Margarita. Madiane, je crois que vous aviez levé la main le premier.
C'est pas grave. Merci beaucoup, Professor Otto. I will talk in English because I know that is more comfortable for you. So I would first of all thank you for this very beautiful presentation about the concept or the notion of rules. You have analyzed the use and the signification of the concepts. So I want to know if we can say that the art and regulars are a form of evolution for the regular? And do we have an evolution of the notion or approach? In other words, I would know more if the notion is passing maybe from a notion to the approach, or the notion has served the grammar for approach.
Is this a general question, or do you refer directly to the Arabic examples?
Exactly. I remarked that you talk about the concept in the different phases of history. So I imagine that we will have maybe a evolution of this concept.
The concept of irregular.
Exactly.
There is an evolution, yeah, and there is also there are many examples where we still find the Latin irregularities as a title of a section in a grammar, because they were irregular in Latin. Sometimes they try to find a certain regularity in the irregular forms. There are sometimes some rules behind the rules which can explain some exceptions, and then you need again a second level rule. But even it can fall outside that. And it is also important to know, did really the linguistic data reach them? Was that the basis for their linguistic analysis? Or was it the other way around? They tried to apply what they knew and what they wanted to see as irregular. And in that case, they had similar problems also for Spanish. As the example, estotro with syncopa, you can pronounce in that case. They also explain this clearly in the Filipinian grammar about a glottal stop. You can pronounce it with a stop, with examples, with clear examples. This is the language now which must tell us the rule and not the other way around. So there is an evolution, and since there is so much, it's difficult to say that in this period it was that way and then we find this one, because also it is completely absolutely not systematic approach, but we find many different approaches in that sense. And irregularities, they must be also seen as an obligatory part of the, after the verbos frequentativos, you find usual incoativos, then you find usually also then the verbos irregulares. And some more, and of course in Mexico you find verbos aplicativos, you find the referential forms, etc. But always there is a place for irregulars. And it is interesting, I did not do that research yet, to look in a more broad picture, what did they consider as irregular? And did they really were governed by the linguistic data themselves, or did they try to find something equivalent which was also irregular in Latin, and try to find something in order to have something in that chapter? Because there must be a conjugaison, there must be the declinaison, but after this one, there must come something like sum es fui, the verb to be, and then there is place for irregular forms. And maybe there's not so much, but the grammar most likely will have a chapter. Also in language like Mapuche, it has so few irregular forms, but there is a chapter, and they needed it because they expected from the Latin grammar that it must be there.
So I think immediately to the phenomenon of shame that we studied together about the example that you gave in proximate plural, I think, le pluriel brisé en français.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, we will discuss it. Wasn't is also studied by missionaries. They use it sometimes here and there, because the examples I demonstrated, Pedro Alcalá didn't know much about linguistic theories, but the Franciscans were very much aware of the production of Westerners who knew the grammatical linguistic theory or had directly access to the sources. Some of them had, and they use also in their Latin many neologisms which are directly derived from Arabic concepts. And this is interesting. That makes all those Franciscans even more interesting. And then I can already say they follow the Arabic system also in that case. What they consider irregular they follow the Arabic approach in that case and talk about consonants which can disappear and weak, and the saying and all those terms we can find also broken plural. You find this also in Spanish as a translation from the Arabic linguistic theory. So if something occurs in Arabic grammar, you will find it even there in a kind of translation or a calque in Latin or a calque in Spanish. They use the terms also for the particles. They have Arabic technical words for them. They talk jasmantes, partículas jasmantes, nasbantes. They have those adjectives in Spanish, they are really all derived from Arabic linguistic terms. I have to check the wasn't what they do with this, but it is a kind of regularity they try to find, like the term template morphology, of course. It is, we can apply this very well to Arabic. And that's also an attempt to see some regularities, and with the regularities are also exceptions. And it deserves much more attention, I think. So I don't have a complete answer to your question.
C'est pas grave. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Il n'y a pas de quoi.
Merci beaucoup, Otto. Je crois qu'après, on avait la question de Margarita et je vois que Bernard a levé la main aussi. Margarita?
Okay, so my question is about the parallel you made with mathematical text and arithmetic text. So my question was, is it something that you were proposing us because these are texts that are found at the same period, or do you really find in the grammars precise references to the arithmetic method or to any mathematical way of structuring rule? Because I was thinking of, like in the 18th century, you know, the elementos etimológicos según el método de Euclides. You know, this is a grammar about Gallego by Sarmiento, where he really makes a point of the fact that he wants to stress the fact that Gallego is actually a much more regular and much higher language than Castellano. So it's a bit in the line of those justifying Basque, but we are at a different stage of this re-evaluation of local languages. So there he makes the point of the parallel with Euclides, just to say how much it is regular, it's even geometric. So I was wondering whether you found some explicit parallels with between the rules of grammar and the rules of mathematics.
Not in the missionary grammars as far as I've seen, but of course there are in Spain there are examples, Carueli Lobkovic with also Gramática Audax. There are many links in Europe with logic. You find often some comparisons. With counting, you see sometimes also the way the indigenous people are counting, and sometimes they use kind of arte arithmetica as well. But the example I demonstrated, it was just chosen as an example that there are other arts which also have their artificio and also their reglas. So it is much broader than only languages. It was just an illustration. But as far as I've seen, there are sometimes in some grammars references to the way you can count in some mathematics as well, but it's an exception. I remember again Ollán Gurin de Santa Inés. He has a part which is, he was a Franciscan author of 3 languages, Tagalog, Chinese and Japanese. But he has also sources which he mentions, which are from logic authors, and others are sometimes also more linked with philosophy generally, and there is some observation about counting, but not, as far as I know, it is, I have not seen that.
Okay, thank you.
Merci. Bernard a levé la main, je vois.
Oui. Merci Otto, c'était superbe ce panorama qui nous menait des Amériques à l'Orient, et il a un peu évoqué le paradigme, Et je pense que c'est voulu, enfin, je l'ai entendu dans ta bouche, hein, le terme, mais la question est la suivante, est-ce que tu penses que la règle peut être en concurrence avec des paradigmes ou est-ce qu'elle est en complément de paradigmes? Parce que, au fond, un paradigme, c'est d'une certaine façon une règle mise en forme. Voilà, et c'est la question que je me posais. Ça peut être aussi une répartition de la matière, hein, si ça concerne plutôt, si le grammairien apporte plutôt des questions de correction dans la langue, etc., ça peut se prêter moins à la mise en forme sous paradigme. Alors voilà, c'est ma question.
Oui, merci bien pour la question très intéressante. Les règles sont, c'est vrai, c'est correct, complément du paradigme, mais les paradigmes sont surtout ce qu'on trouve dans les grammaires avec les parties du discours comme le verbe et le nom avec la conjugaison qui peut-être n'existe pas dans la langue, mais il y a un paradigme avec les règles. Mais les exemples que nous avons vus, c'est surtout les règles qui n'ont aucune relation avec les parties du discours. C'est surtout une relation avec les particules, ligaduras et la racine dans ce cas. Pour la langue tagalo, dans ce cas, on veut étudier la racine et les particules. Et les règles, on peut les appliquer pour les particules et les deux, les racines. Et avec les racines, nous pouvons dériver un verbe, ou peut-être on peut dériver de ça un nom substantif. Mais le terme qu'on veut commencer avec ça, racine et après particules et les règles pour être capable d'utiliser, appliquer un bon usage des particules et les racines. Mais ça vient après le paradigme. Normalement, on trouve ça aussi aux Philippines. Blancas de San José est une exception parce que le texte est toujours courant, sans paradigme. C'est aussi une question de l'imprimerie. Dans ce cas, on ne trouve pas les paradigmes qu'on trouve aussi aux Philippines et au Mexique. Mais c'est un texte avec beaucoup d'informations, avec les références, mais les règles, dans ce cas, n'ont pas une relation avec les parties du discours, mais avec les racines et les particules. Mais c'est complément aussi, n'est-ce pas? Mais on trouve les morphèmes, les suffixes obligatoires et autres sont peut-être les adverbes et aussi les particules modales, etc. Pour l'interrogation, dans ce cas, il n'y a pas de relation directe avec une classe de mots ou avec une partie du discours, mais l'énoncé dans sa totalité, dans ce cas. La phrase ou peut-être modos de hablar, maneras de hablar. Et on trouve aussi les particules pour les questions. Et qu'est-ce qu'on peut faire avec ça? Comme la négation, c'est toujours aussi une place difficile pour les missionnaires. Où pouvons-nous mettre la négation? Parce qu'il y a beaucoup de niveaux. Ça peut être lexical, syntaxique. Il y a beaucoup de conséquences et on trouve quelquefois les règles aussi après le verbe, le paradigme, pour le verbe avec négation. Mais beaucoup de langues, on trouve la négation dedans, dans le verbe et dans ce cas, c'est autre approche. Mais c'est une autre question, pardon. Mais c'est un exemple, n'est-ce pas?
Et ça tient donc à la nature de l'objet étudié.
Oui, oui, oui.
Merci. Merci.
Merci. Je ne vois pas d'autres mains levées. Il n'y a pas d'autres questions non plus dans le chat.
Jean-Michel
a levé la main.
Ah, je ne le vois pas. J'ai perdu Jean-Michel.
Si je parle, tu le verras peut-être, non?
Oui. Voilà. J'avais un problème d'affichage.
Merci Otto pour les langues des Philippines. En général, comment font-ils? Ils mettent tout ce qui concerne les diathèses dans les réglas?
Comment toute la diathèse
dans les grammaires des langues, dans les grammaires des langues des Philippines, ils mettent tout ce qui concerne la diathèse dans les réglas, pas dans la conjugaison de verbes.
Presque tout se trouve là, oui.
Ah oui.
Et c'est très détaillé.
Oui, mais dans les réglas, pas dans les conjugaisons de verbes.
Oui, mais toujours avec une relation avec la racine, et après vient les exemples et la diathèse, les formes. Je crois qu'il y a 5 plus ou moins. Dans ce cas, et aussi avec facere, les causatifs. C'est un terme qu'on a, nouveau terme qu'on a employé dans ce facere, les causatifs. Tout se trouve dans la partie avec le titre Reglas.
Est-ce qu'il correspondrait alors chez nous?
Maak, pak, tous les, aussi le passif avec c'est l'infixe dans ce cas, on peut trouver la même. C'est la première partie, je crois, c'est surtout le passif avec l'infixe. Et pour voir la différence entre acheter et vendre, on trouve la même racine et avec autre infixe dans ce cas. Et c'est le chapitre, un chapitre aussi une règle. Mais comme dans la terminologie de Bernard, c'est aussi un complément du paradigme qui vient avant. C'est pour les enfants peut-être, pour les débutants, et après vient. Mais ce n'est pas dans un chapitre sur le verbe, mais surtout la racine.
Alors, qu'est-ce qui reste pour les verbes? Parce que si tout est dans les réglas, qu'est-ce qui reste pour le verbe alors?
C'est seulement une information pour les débutants et il y a quelques définitions et il y a un génitif, nominatif, datif selon le schème de la grammaire latine. Mais c'est tout, c'est une grammaire abréviée, Arte breve. On trouve quelques définitions, mais pas beaucoup, mais c'est seulement pour commencer, je crois.
Merci.
Les débutants.
Est-ce qu'il y a d'autres questions? Je ne vois plus de mains levées. Donc, si vous voulez, on peut remercier encore très chaleureusement Otto pour cette superbe présentation.